In September 2024, a paper was published in Science Robotics, one of the most prestigious journals in the field. It described two robots, one moved on wheels, the other walked on four soft legs, shaped roughly like a spider. Both were controlled in real time by electrical signals from a living organism. That organism was a king oyster mushroom. We're not talking about a simulation of a mushroom or an algorithm inspired by one. It was a real fungus grown in a petri dish, wired into the robotics electronics, sensing its environment and issuing commands through its own natural electrical activity. This is the story of how we got there, and it starts, strangely enough, with the question about language. In 2022, a computer scientist named Andrew Adamatzky published a study in the journal Royal Society Open Science. Adamatzky works at the Unconventional Computing Laboratory at the University of the West of England, and the word unconventional is apt here. Over his career, he has investigated whether slime molds can solve mazes, whether chemical systems can perform logic operations, and whether living organisms might one day replace silicon in computing devices. He's not a mainstream figure, partly because he's the kind of researcher who asks questions most of his colleagues would consider embarrassing. But some of his answers to these unconventional questions have proved to be so profound that the entire field is now paying attention. In this particular study, he took 4 species of fungi, ghost fungi, enoki, split gill mushrooms and cordyceps, inserted tiny electrodes into them and recorded their electrical activity every second over 24 hours. What came back was a stream of voltage spikes. Some were brief, some lasted hours. Spike durations varied from 1 to 21 hours, with amplitudes ranging from 0.3 to 2.1 millivolts. And they weren't random, they came in clusters, bursts of activity followed by quiet, followed by another burst. What Adamatzky noticed was that these clusters bore a structural resemblance to something familiar. In any human language, words vary in length. Most are short, a few are very long. And when you plot the distribution of word lengths across any language, you get a characteristic mathematical curve, a fingerprint of how information tends to be structured when it needs to be communicated efficiently. He found that distributions of fungal word lengths match those of human language. The total vocabulary reached up to 50 words, though the core of most frequently used signals didn't exceed 15 to 20. The headlines went predictably wild, mushrooms have language, fungi are talking to each other, and just as predictably, the backlash followed. Dan Beber, an ecologist at the University of Exeter, put it bluntly. The interpretation as language seems somewhat over-enthusiastic and would require far more research and testing of critical hypothesis before we see fungus on Google Translate. He's right, and Adamatzky himself said so. We do not know if there's a direct relationship between spiking patterns in fungi and human speech. Possibly not, he told The Guardian. The possibility remains that the electrical signals do not represent communication in any form at all. Rather, charged hyphal tips passing an electrode could have generated the spikes observed. The patterns might just be a side effect of growth, biological noise that our pattern-hungry brains find meaningful. So you might reasonably think, interesting idea, probably nothing, let's move on. But the headlines missed something. The question of whether fungi have language turns out not to be the interesting question. The interesting question is what those electrical signals are actually doing, because in the 3 years since that paper was published, the answer has started to come into focus, and it is far stranger and far more useful than anyone expected. To understand why, you need to understand what mycelium actually is. The mushroom you can see above ground is just the tip of the structure. Beneath it, spreading sometimes for kilometers through the soil, is the mycelium, a vast network of microscopic filaments called hyphae, woven through the earth, connecting to tree roots, to other fungi, to the underground world. In the Pacific Northwest, single fungal colonies have been found spanning several hectares. By some measures, mycelium networks are the largest individual organisms on the planet. And through all of this, electrical signals are constantly flowing. This has actually been known since 1976, when researchers first detected action potential-like spikes in fungal mycelia. But for decades, the prevailing view was that these signals were largely incidental, background noise generated by cellular processes and not meaningful information. What's changed in the last few years is that researchers have started asking a different question. What if it doesn't matter whether the signals are language? What if it matters that the signals are real, responsive, and consistent enough to be used? Because the mycelium is extraordinarily sensitive. Fungi can detect light, chemicals, gases, gravity, and electrical fields. They can respond to changes in the pH of their substrate, to toxic metals, CO2, and the direction of fluid flow. The electrical signals respond to changes in the environment such as food and injury. When part of the network is damaged, the electrical activity changes. When the chemistry of the surrounding soil shifts, the signals shift. The mycelium is, in a very literal sense, already doing what we spend billions of dollars trying to engineer into synthetic sensors, monitoring its environment continuously, in real time, across enormous distances, transmitting that information electrically. Which brings us back to those robots. The Cornell team, led by researcher Anand Mishra, started simply. They began by cultivating king oyster mushrooms in the lab from a simple kit ordered online. They grew the mycelium in small chambers fitted with electrodes, letting the fungus grow around the wires and wrap itself into the interface. The system Mishra developed accurately reads and processes the mycelium's raw electrical activity and converts it into digital information that can activate the robot's actuators or moving parts. 2 biohybrid robots were built, a soft robot shaped like a spider and a wheeled bot. The robots completed 3 experiments. First, the robots walked and rolled as a response to the natural continuous spikes in the mycelium's signal. Then the researchers shone ultraviolet light on the fungal chambers. Mushrooms don't like light. The electrical signals changed in response, and the robots changed their gait. In a third experiment, the researchers were able to override the mycelium's native signal entirely, pausing or redirecting the robot without damaging the tissue. Biological autonomy and human supervision running through the same fungal interface. The reason this matters isn't just that it's remarkable, it's that it solves a problem that has plagued biohybrid robotics for years. Previous attempts to build living robots have used animal muscle cells or plant tissue. These are difficult to keep healthy, require strict lab conditions, and degrade quickly. Mycelium handle rougher settings. They tolerate swings in humidity and temperature, grow on basic nutrients, and respond to many cues. That toughness makes them appealing for robots meant to operate outdoors or in messy environments where dust, vibration, and weather get in the way. And Mishra was direct about what the real potential is. The current robots respond to light. The next generation will respond to chemistry. The potential for future robots could be to sense soil chemistry in row crops and decide when to add more fertilizer, perhaps mitigating downstream effects of agriculture like harmful algal blooms. Think about what that means. A robot that doesn't need a synthetic sensor to detect what's in the soil because the sensor is already there, already alive, already reading the environment the way it has evolved to do over hundreds of millions of years. Fungi are everywhere, and creating these robots could be feasible in areas with fewer resources. You could potentially send a small amount of mycelium to a remote destination, grow it up, and build robots there, meaning there could also be applications in space robotics. Lead author Mishra described something that hit me when I read it. This kind of project is not about controlling a robot. It's about creating a true connection with the living system. Because once you hear the signal, you also understand what's going on. Those signals we can't visualize, but the robot is making a visualization. But the robots are only one direction this has gone. At Ohio State University in October 2025, a team published a study in PLOS One with a finding that, on the surface, sounds impossible. They had built a working computer memory out of a shiitake mushroom. Again, it's not a computer inspired by a mushroom, it's not a metaphor. The Ohio team grew and trained shiitake fungi to perform like computer chips, capable of switching between electrical states thousands of times per second. These fungal circuits are biodegradable and low cost, opening the door to sustainable, brain-like computing. The component they created is called a memristor, a memory resistor. It's a type of circuit element that changes in resistance depending on how much current has passed through it. In other words, it remembers. Traditional memristors are made from metal oxides or silicon and require rare earth minerals, high temperature production, and a lot of power to run. By contrast, fungi mycelium can be grown at room temperature, and at the end of its life cycle, it can be composted. After 2 months of testing, the mushroom-based memristor could switch between electrical states up to 5,850 times per second with about 90% accuracy. When performance dropped at higher frequencies, connecting more mushrooms to the circuit restored stability, much like neural connections in the human brain. To be clear about where this stands, commercial silicon chips operate at billions of cycles per second, leaving a substantial gap between fungal circuits and conventional hardware. Nobody is running their laptop on a shiitake mushroom anytime soon, but the direction of travel is striking. These are the first baby steps, and they are being taken with an organism that costs almost nothing to grow, requires no rare earth mining, no clean rooms, no toxic chemicals in fabrication, and at the end of its useful life, you can put it in a compost heap. The Ohio team concluded their paper with a line that is either a prediction or a provocation. The future of computing could be fungal. Now, here is where we have to be honest about what we still don't know. In January 2025, a major review paper was published in FEMS Microbiology Reviews, essentially the field pausing to take stock of where things actually stand. Its conclusion was measured. Studying electrical phenomena in fungal networks presents unique challenges due to the microscopic dimensions of hyphae, the structural complexity of highly modular mycelial networks, and the limitation of traditional electrophysiological methods. There's also a broader scientific debate that has been intensifying alongside all of this. The idea of the wood wide web, the romantic notion that forests are cooperating networks of trees sharing resources and information through fungal connections, has faced serious pushback. Critics argue that the evidence has been overstated, that the cooperative narrative got ahead of the data, and that what's actually happening underground is messier and more contested than popular stories suggest. This is important because it's a reminder that fungi and the signals moving through them are very difficult to study. The mycelium is microscopic, the networks are vast and structurally complex. The signals are tiny. The function of electrical signaling in intracellular communication in fungi remains unclear. Adamatzky himself acknowledged, even in his original language paper, that we haven't deciphered the language of cats and dogs despite living with them for centuries, and fungi are considerably harder. But notice something. The researchers building robots and memory chips out of mycelium are not waiting for that question to be resolved. They don't need to know what the signals mean to use them. The mycelium's electrical activity is real, measurable, responsive to the environment, and robust enough to control a walk-in robot. Whether or not it constitutes language is, in a practical sense, besides the point. There is a strange philosophical current running underneath all this that I find difficult to shake. For most of human history, we have drawn a firm line between tools and organisms. A hammer is a tool, a tree is an organism. These categories don't mix. But what the mycelium researchers are doing is something very different. They're not engineering a tool that mimics biology. They are taking biology and wiring it directly into a machine. The sensor, the processor, and the living thing are the same object. Adamatzky has described the baseline electrical hum of the mycelium, the continuous signal that seems to maintain coherence across the network, as analogous to wolves howling just to tell each other about their presence. Not necessarily as language, but as a way to just say that I'm here, we're still connected. If that interpretation is even approximately right, it means something that has no brain, no nervous system, and no obvious capacity for awareness is nonetheless sustaining a kind of continuous, distributed communication with itself, checking in across kilometers of soil, keeping the network coherent in real time. And now we're listening to it, and we're talking back in the only language we share with it, electricity. We've been walking over this network for our entire existence as a species. It has been sensing the world around it, signaling through the dark, doing whatever it is that fungi do for 500 million years before we even arrived. And now, for the first time, we've started to actually plug into it. We have no idea yet what we'll be able to hear, but somewhere beneath your feet right now, the network is already transmitting. I'll link to all the studies mentioned below, and if you want more like this about fungi and nature's intelligence, then sign up for my newsletter, The Spore Report. The link is also below.